George IV was not just a king of the 19th century. He was the embodiment of boundless self-destruction. He indulged in excessive eating, drowning himself in alcohol and laudanum, liquid opium, to the point where his body weighed over 120 kilograms, transforming him into a bloated, blind, foul-smelling mass of flesh. Hey guys, tonight we will witness the deeply ironic end of a king, a death that no one dared to wish for, but was in fact what all of England was waiting for. That is King George IV. Imagine this, a man who was once the ultimate standard for fashion, architecture, and unparalleled charm. A man who transformed London into the glittering capital of Europe. Yet, hidden beneath the gold-laced robes and the ornate walls of the Royal Pavilion was a medical and spiritual tragedy. How could a king turn his own palace into a prison filled with revulsion, making even his servants hold their noses and despise him? And why, when he passed away, was the only legacy he left not respect, but a collective sense of relief? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And just so I know where you're relaxing, please comment and let me know the city you're living in and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the annals of the British monarchy, the death of King George IV in the year 1830 is regarded as one of the most horrifying symbols of decadence and decay. Born on the 12th of August in the year 1762, Prince George Augustus Frederick was the eldest of 9 children born to King George III and Queen Charlotte. His father, King George III, was famed as the longest reigning monarch in English history, known for his profound religious faith and strict discipline. His mother, Queen Charlotte, came from the Mecklenburg-Strelitz dynasty, bringing to the British court a rare blend of courtly dignity and subtle oriental grace. Within the royal family, George's lineage and status were unparalleled. He was the true heir to the throne, expected to uphold the stability and noble reputation of his house. From his earliest years, George Augustus Frederick received a rigorous education at the Kensington Academy. He studied Latin, Greek, Roman and Greek history, theology, and mastered the arts of horsemanship and fencing. Distinguished tutors instilled in him a broad foundation of knowledge, public speaking, classical law, and the rudiments of leadership. George had at least 8 siblings, the most notable of whom were Princess Elizabeth and Prince Frederick. Though bound by blood, their relationships were often strained by silent competition and the strict royal protocols that forbade them from expressing independent personalities. By custom, Prince George officially received the title of Prince of Wales at the age of 13 in the year 1775. In the year 1780, when his father suffered a breakdown of the mind, George, now the de facto ruler, was appointed regent by the British Parliament, wielding royal authority until King George III's death. This responsibility should have allowed him to confirm his virtue and establish a glorious regency era. Indeed, during his regency, George supported improvements to the public transport system, initiating the Blackfriars railway station and refurbishing Regent's Park to provide green spaces for the public. He also vigorously patronised the arts, funding the Royal Academy and encouraging painters and sculptors to innovate in the neoclassical Regency style. However, behind these contributions, Prince George gradually descended into a life of luxury. He ordered Carlton House to be transformed into the most lavish reception centre in Europe, hired a royal orchestra, and invested lavishly in weekly grand balls. Night after night, Baroque music or waltzes filled the oval-panelled ceilings, candlelight flickering in crystal goblets. Endless feasting became his hallmark. Champagne, port, and Madeira flowed freely, and tables overflowed with red meats, royal poultry, and imported fruits. For breakfast alone, George might enjoy 2 roasted pigeons, 3 steaks of beef, the greater part of a bottle of white wine, a glass of champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, all before the clock struck 10. Such extravagance swiftly precipitated a financial crisis. Creditors buried George under mountains of debt, forcing Parliament to repeatedly allocate emergency funds. Each tranche approved was immediately squandered on expensive jewellery, gold-gilded furnishings, and opulent riverside villas along the Thames. His private life bristled with scandal. In the year 1785, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, in breach of the Royal Marriages Act, plunging the nation into consternation and a constitutional crisis. A decade later, he was compelled to marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick, an infamous union that ended on their wedding night, when the groom, intoxicated, collapsed unconscious by the hearth, sparking satirical cartoons across London's gossip sheets. It was precisely this unbounded lifestyle, this disregard for royal duty, and the ever-mounting debts that laid the foundation for George's ultimate debauchery and precipitous decline. Once admired as the first gentleman of England, he became a symbol of unrestrained indulgence, his body swelling past 127 kilograms, his face bloated, skin mottled with fat, and layers of velvet and lace unable to conceal the hollowness reflected in every contour. This marked the beginning of his dark final chapter, in which both body and spirit would be eroded by bottomless ambition and relentless temptation. The 1870s witnessed a profound turning point in the lifestyle of George IV, as he transformed Carlton House into the epicenter of the most lavish entertainments Europe had ever seen. While King George III extolled virtue, thrift, and discipline, his son abandoned all restraint in favor of endless revelry. On any given morning, the prince might feast upon 2 roasted pigeons, 3 thick cuts of beefsteak, most of a bottle of white wine, a glass of champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, all consumed before the clock struck 10. Luncheons and dinners alike resembled the wild banquets of ancient Rome, with tables piled high with game birds and red meats, and rivers of wine flowing freely into crystal goblets. Simultaneously, his debts mounted to a staggering degree, compelling the British Parliament to extend rescue loans time and again, only to witness the prince immediately squander each gift upon extravagant jewellery, gilded furnishings, and palatial estates along the Thames. In the year 1785, defying both convention and statute, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, in direct violation of the Act of Settlement 1701, an act that triggered whispers of a constitutional crisis and fanned the flames of political unrest. A decade later, duty compelled him into a marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick, an arrangement that proved disastrous from the very first moments. On their wedding night, the groom, already deep in his cups, collapsed unconscious by the hearth, setting the tone for years of public scandal and private humiliation. Satirical pamphleteers and cartoonists gleefully chronicled each fresh indignity, from the couple's public spats to the prince's merciless persecution of his reluctant bride. Such unbridled indulgence, overwhelming debt, and notorious marriages became the very embodiment of George's guiding principle, that money existed not as a tool for responsible stewardship, but as fuel for his personal desires. Day after day, week after week, the grand halls of Carlton House echoed with laughter and music while the king's creditors watched from the shadows, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Lanterns glimmered over tables laden with exotic dishes and spiced fruits imported from across the empire. Harps and violins murmured romantic airs as courtiers danced beneath frescoed ceilings. Yet beneath the shimmering surface lay an abyss of financial ruin and moral decay. Despite occasional glimmers of genuine affection moments when George appeared more man than monarch, these were swiftly eclipsed by renewed bouts of extravagance. He commissioned new wings for Carlton House, filled them with the finest silks and velvets, and surrounded himself with a retinue of perfumed courtiers eager to vie for his fleeting attention. His passion for fashion led him to spend fortunes on tailor-made coats, embroidered waistcoats, and towering wigs dusted with the palest of powders, all in a vain attempt to mask the physical toll of his own excess. By the time the decade drew to a close, the prince's reputation lay in tatters. Dinners that began with trumpets and fanfare ended in disorder and opium-laced stupors. Parliament, weary of bailing out his compulsive spending, threatened to impose stricter controls on royal finances. But George defied them with flamboyant defiance. Instead of curbing his appetites, he seemed to revel in the notoriety, as though each borrowed pound and each scandalous headline validated his belief that life's true purpose lay in perpetual pleasure. And so, the 1880s stand as a testament to the tragic consequences of unmeasured indulgence. George IV, once hailed as England's first gentleman, allowed his instincts for revelry and ostentation to overshadow any sense of duty or moderation. His spoilt wealth and ungoverned passions propelled him toward a path of ruin, leaving behind a cautionary legacy that continues to whisper through the corridors of history, that unchecked extravagance, no matter how gilded its veneer, ultimately leads to moral and financial collapse. The feud between George and Princess Caroline deepened even further when, in the year 1820, he ascended the throne as King George IV. Though he now bore the royal title, he persisted in a relentless campaign to besmirch his estranged wife, barring her from attending his coronation, a spiteful act that ignited public outrage. Once admired for his dashing good looks, by the year 1797, at the age of 35, he had ballooned to 110 kilograms, his once handsome features swollen and sagging beneath layers of flesh. Yet George refused to abandon appearances. He laced his torso into a corset made of whalebone to cinch his expansive waist, donned elaborate powdered wigs, and applied rouge to mask the advancing tide of age. In the year 1810, when King George III succumbed to mental illness, George Augustus Frederick became regent, wielding the full powers of monarchy in his father's stead. This regency should have marked the high point of his influence, yet instead it magnified his debauched lifestyle. He lavished patronage upon the arts and architecture, sponsoring painters and architects across London, and he orchestrated the social seasons with unparalleled extravagance. Society balls glittered with crystal chandeliers and gowns of shimmering satin, while frescoed salons resonated with harpsichord and violin. Beneath that veneer of sophistication, however, lay banquets of nightmarish excess. Tables buckled under the weight of game birds, roast meats, and exotic fruits imported at great expense. Wine flowed in rivers of Burgundy and Champagne, as courtiers raised goblets in dutiful toasts. Yet even these spectacles paled beside George's personal descent into inebriety and addiction. He drank with a relish that astonished even the hardiest nobleman, draining casks of port and claret until he reeled with intoxication. More troubling still was his reliance on laudanum, a liquid opiate that left him senseless for days at a time. He swallowed spoonfuls of the tincture before each engagement, intending to steady his nerves, only to slip into stupors that rendered him incapable of speech or movement. His friends, men accustomed to the wildest of revels, were appalled to find their host sprawled unconscious in plush armchairs, foam at his lips, eyes glazed and unseeing. To them, it was as though the king were more machine than man, driven by chemical impulses rather than regal will. Even his most loyal advisers trembled at his excesses. Ministers who had hoped to steer the realm through reforms found themselves reduced to caretakers, watching over his opiate-induced torpor and coaxing him into a carriage for state ceremonies. Diplomats whispered that the sovereign of Great Britain was either perpetually drunk or drugged, unable to command his faculties. Yet George persisted, convinced that his largesse in art and architecture would eclipse any criticism of his personal vices. Thus did the Regency years epitomize a paradox. The same monarch who elevated London's cultural scene to dazzling heights was simultaneously consuming himself from within. His palaces, refitted with neoclassical columns and frescoed ceilings, stood as monuments to his refined taste, even as he lurched through corridors reeking of spirits and opiates. And so George IV, crowned regent in the year 1810, unwittingly laid the groundwork for his own downfall, spinning a tapestry of splendor woven through with threads of excess, addiction, and scandal. During the Regency years, from 1811 to 1820, George IV's cultural and artistic patronage shone with remarkable intensity. He endowed painters and sculptors with generous stipends, commissioned frescoes and statues to adorn Carlton House and Windsor Castle, and oversaw sumptuous balls that transformed London's social calendar into a dazzling season of spectacles. Every corner of the capital seemed to bear his touch. Theatres reopened under his patronage, galleries expanded their collections, and salons buzzed with conversation about the latest architectural marvels in the neoclassical Regency style. Yet it was precisely this very extravagance that accelerated his moral and physical decline. In the first 6 weeks of the year 1816 alone, over 2,300 kilograms of meat were delivered to Carlton House, enough to feed an entire regiment, without counting the vast quantities of poultry and sausages that accompanied it. Carcasses of venison, boar's head bedecked with gilded horns, and whole roasted calves made regular appearances, while fountains of Burgundy and Champagne gushed into crystal flutes. George's appetite was boundless. After each gargantuan feast, he would slump into an armchair, his eyelids fluttering as if on the verge of slipping into unconsciousness, provoking horror even among the most jaded of his guests. When he finally ascended the throne in the year 1821, his coronation proved the pinnacle of lavish folly. The ceremonies tab reached nearly £1 million sterling, a sum so vast it defied comprehension in that era. Draped in robes of silver cloth, each seam embroidered with twisted threads of bullion, he wore upon his brow a crown set with more than 12,000 diamonds rented solely for the occasion. Court poets and satirists clamoured to depict him as the mighty whale in evening dress, and pamphlets circulated that likened his regal procession to a lumbering leviathan, majestic yet grotesquely out of place upon the opulent stage. But the public mockery had its darker repercussions. Politically, George's impulsive interjections into government affairs, flash decisions announced at banquets, abrupt reversals of policy telegrammed in the dead of night, earned him a reputation for capriciousness. More damaging still was his obsession with divorcing Queen Caroline, a spectacle that played out in the courts of Parliament and the columns of every newspaper. By fixating on personal grievances, he alienated allies and enraged subjects who saw his crusade against his wife as vindictive and out of touch with the kingdom's needs. Faced with a king whose priorities lay in personal vendettas and costume jewellery, Parliament and Cabinet found themselves wrestling for the reins of governance. Votes of confidence were delayed, ministers were appointed only after interminable scrutiny, and royal expenditures fell under unprecedented audits. Whispers circulated of a caretaker monarchy, in which the sovereign was little more than a ceremonial figurehead, while real power resided in the hands of his cautious ministers. Yet back at Carlton House the parties went on. Beneath glittering chandeliers and amid the soft strains of programmed minuets, courtiers toasted the health of a monarch who was, in truth, too inebriated or drugged to comprehend their words. Laudanum, the liquid opiate he so relied upon, left him in frequent stupors, his staff tasked with rousing him for public appearances that often ended in confusion and incoherence. The very gatherings that were meant to cement his stature instead laid bare the tragic excesses that had come to define his regency. And so, while George IV's cultural fingerprints remain etched upon London's architecture and art collections, the sheen of his contributions is forever tarnished by the memory of his overweening appetite. His reign stands as a testament to the paradox of patronage bound to personal indulgence. For every statue erected in marble splendour, there echoed the hollow clinks of crystal glasses drained of claret. In that sleepy twilight between glory and decay, the Regency years unfolded as a cautionary tale, reminding us that the line between lavish support for the arts and self-destructive prodigality can be all too thin. In his final years, King George IV sank ever deeper into illness and misery. His weight soared past 127 kilograms, and his legs swelled with fluid so severely that he could no longer climb a single staircase. After a failed cataract operation, his vision blurred to the point of near blindness, leaving him unable to read the simplest document. He could not even sign his own name. Parliament was forced to use a facsimile seal in place of his royal signature. Gout, the aristocrat's plague, ravaged his fingers and toes, deforming them until he could neither hold a fork nor grasp a pen. Every meal became a ritual of dependence, as servants fed him morsel by morsel, their hands gentle but uncomfortably close. His skin, once smooth and polished, now stretched taut over festering sores. Ulcerations oozed pus that trickled down his flanks and thighs. The stench of decay clung to every corner of Carlton House. Visitors dared not linger, often retreating with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses in desperate attempts to ward off the foul odour. In his torment, George forbade any mirror to remain in his chambers, unable to bear the sight of his own distorted reflection. Paranoia took firm root in his troubled mind, and he would accuse attendants of plotting against him, convinced they whispered behind his back. At times, tears streamed down his swollen cheeks as crushing depression washed over him. Anger followed close behind, sudden and ferocious, erupting without warning over imagined affronts. Each emotional outburst left the household reeling, trapped in the unsettling tension of a king at war with his own body and mind. Movement was a spectacle of both pity and shame. A custom-built wheelchair, reinforced with iron bands, was the only means by which he could traverse the palace corridors. Servants strained at ropes and pulleys to guide the wheeled throne across thresholds and down passages. Each journey was accompanied by the rasp of his laboured breathing, echoing through halls that once rang with regal laughter. In the eyes of those who served him, The mighty monarch had become nothing more than a burden too immense to carry. In constant agony, George beseeched physicians for any remedy tonics that promised miraculous recovery, restorative elixirs, and secret concoctions distilled from mysterious herbs. His chambers overflowed with half-empty phials and discarded droppers stained with ominous residues. Yet each new potion offered only fleeting respite before plunging him back into a cycle of pain and numbness. He lingered in a twilight realm between life and oblivion, trapped in a body that rebelled against its own survival. The corruption of both flesh and spirit reached a tragic crescendo. Laudanum, his ever-present companion, lulled him into a stupor that blurred the boundaries between wakefulness and dream. He drifted through hours of drug-induced oblivion, only to awaken to fresh torment. The same hands that once signed proclamations of power now trembled as they clutched the drapes, seeking comfort that could never hold. In those desolate days, the once celebrated First Gentleman of England stood as a sombre testament to the perils of unrestrained indulgence. His final existence was neither regal nor dignified, but a slow-motion collapse into indignity and despair. The corridors of Carlton House, once alive with pageantry and music, now echoed with the sound of a tortured breath and the soft patter of anxious footsteps. Thus did King George IV become a tragic emblem of excess's fatal toll. His was a life consumed by appetite of food, of wine, of opiates, until body and soul alike were devoured. In the hush that followed his passing, the lesson remained clear, that boundless consumption, unchecked by prudence or mercy, can only lead to ruin. And so the curtain fell on a reign defined by the tragic consequences of unchecked indulgence, leaving behind a cautionary legacy both harrowing and unforgettable. After a coronation as lavish as it was ignominious, King George IV's health plummeted into a realm of irreversible decline. His weight, having soared past 127 kilograms, forced him into constant reliance upon mechanical aids just to shift from one chamber to another. Even more troubling was his growing dependence on laudanum, the liquid opiate. Before every public appearance, the king swallowed over 100 drops of the tincture, enough to render most healthy men unconscious. As a result, he spent much of his time in a semi-delirious stupor, his speech slurred and his thoughts muddled, prompting visiting diplomats to whisper, "It seems the King of England is forever confused or entranced by his own poison." His failing eyesight only compounded the crisis. After a botched cataract operation in the year 1829, his vision deteriorated so drastically that, by the following year, he could scarcely distinguish a friend's face. Unable to read or sign official documents, he left the sovereign's duties in limbo. Parliament resorted to affixing a facsimile seal in lieu of his royal signature to keep the machinery of government from grinding to a halt. Simultaneously, gout ravaged his joints with merciless brutality. His fingers and toes swelled grotesquely, deforming beyond recognition, and robbing him of the ability to grasp even the simplest of utensils. Servants had to feed him each morsel by hand, transforming his daily meals into exercises in both pity and dread. Carlton House, once ablaze with chandeliers and music, now resembled a makeshift infirmary. Camp beds clustered in the corridors, and nurses overworked and overwhelmed hovered at every turn, providing round-the-clock care. The king's flesh, once pruned by royal barbers and powdered to perfection, now ballooned with fluid retention and stretched taut over festering ulcerations. Purulent discharge seeped into his bedding, and no amount of change or cleansing could stave off the fetid stench that permeated each room. Guests, upon entering his chambers, found themselves instinctively covering their noses, retreating hastily lest the rank air overwhelm them. As the physical agony bore down, a parallel mental unravelling took hold. Unable to bear his own reflection, George commanded that every mirror be removed from the royal apartments. The thought of confronting his distorted visage, bloated and decayed, filled him with such revulsion that he preferred darkness to any glimmer of self-perception. Paranoia planted its roots deep in his fractured mind. He accused loyal attendants of hidden conspiracies, convinced that each whispered conversation trebled in frequency at his expense. Laudanum-induced hallucinations only intensified the torment, propelling him into frenzied rants or inconsolable despair. In one moment he would weep bitter tears of remorse, his sobs echoing down the gilded hallways, lamenting the squandered years of youth and privilege. Then, without warning, rage would flare angry curses hurled at invisible foes as he clutched at the drapes, searching for a scapegoat in the dark corners of his fevered imagination. Through it all, the house resounded with the rasp of his laboured breathing and the occasional piercing scream, a haunting soundtrack to a sovereign's final descent. Thus, disintegration reigned supreme in those final days, the monarchy's grandeur supplanted by a tableau of human frailty, each agonized breath a reminder that no throne can shield its occupant from the cruelty of unchecked excess. The corridors that once echoed with pomp and ceremony now bore silent witness to the tragic demise of a king consumed by his own appetite for pleasure and ease. And as the candles guttered low in the dim rooms, George IV, pillar of a nation's crown, lay ensnared in the merciless grip of suffering, his legacy forever bound to the fatal consequences of unbridled indulgence. In his final chapter, George IV endured each day as though imprisoned within his own ruined flesh. He withdrew almost entirely into his private apartments, venturing outside only when carried in a custom-built wheelchair large enough to bear his prodigious bulk. Each journey through the palace became a grueling ordeal. Pulleys creaked and chains rattled as attendants strained to haul his wheeled throne along the marble floors, their tired groans echoing down corridors once alive with stately procession. To the servants, accustomed to obedience and ritual, the king had become nothing more than a breathing hulk of flesh, a burden they loathed, yet could not abandon. His pained moans reverberated through the grand halls, erasing every trace of sovereign majesty he had once embodied. Faced with the cruel reality of his physical collapse, George sought refuge in fervent religious confession. He spent hours pouring out his sins to trembling chaplains, who recorded each sordid detail of his libertine affairs and carnal excess. His tears, laced with guilt and desperation, streamed down his once regal visage as he begged for absolution. Yet these harrowing penitential sessions, rather than soothing his tormented body, plunged him deeper into despair. Each recalled transgression seemed to widen the chasm between his guilt-ridden soul and his failing frame, intensifying both his spiritual anguish and his physical suffering. Friendships, once bedrocks of his courtly life, unravelled before his ailing eyes. His longtime confidant, the Duke of Conyngham, gradually withdrew, repelled by the rancid stench that clung to the king's festering wounds. Other associates, wearied by the grotesque tableau, offered perfunctory visits before slinking away, uneasy at the sight of a ruler so ravaged by decay. Only the household servants remained tethered to his side, bound by duty and coin to the grim task of tending his every need. They wrapped cloth masks about their faces to stave off the foul odour, and donned thick leather gloves to avoid direct contact with his bloated limbs. Each day they waged a silent battle against nausea, offering comfort in small measures even as gratefulness turned to silent dread. In the seat of government, alarm rippled through every council chamber. Ministers huddled in secret sessions, their whispered deliberations centred on contingency plans should the king become entirely incapacitated. The prospect of a throne without a living sovereign cast a pall over Westminster. They began quietly to prepare for the accession of William, George's younger brother. Official bulletins maintained a facade of stability, speaking only of temporary indispositions, but in the newsrooms and print shops, scandalous sketches of the king's plight flew off the presses. Caricaturists depicted his wheelchair rolling through the palace gates, attended by gagging pages, while headlines blended pity with scorn. A sovereign sunk in stench. Outside, the public's gaze was both sympathetic and contemptuous. Crowds gathered near Carlton House, some drawn by morbid curiosity, others by genuine concern, each peering through iron railings at a king reduced to ragged breath and whimpering pain. Commoners traded stories in hushed tones. "Did you hear how he cried out for mercy?" they whispered, eyes wide. Shopkeepers paused in their stalls to exchange rumours, while tavern-goers toasted with uneasy laughter that such a once glorious monarch could be laid so low. Thus did the final days of George IV unfold, a convergence of bodily torment and eroding dignity, as he lingered in a private chamber where candles guttered and shadows danced upon peeling walls. The royal household, once orchestrated with precision, now moved in a collective stupor, haunted by the king's intermittent screams and rattled breaths. In that somnolent limbo between life and death, the palace felt less like a seat of power and more like a haunted hospice. And as George IV teetered on the brink of oblivion, his legacy crystallized in the public imagination, not as the pompous regent of a golden era, but as a cautionary portrait of excess's ruinous toll, an echoing lament that a crown, when worn by an unbridled appetite, can become the heaviest of prisons. In his final years, King George IV found himself utterly incapable of caring for even the simplest of needs. He demanded round-the-clock attendance, insisting that pages and nurses remain ever at his side, though in truth they loathed the grim duty imposed upon them. Each night he lay in restless wakefulness, ordering a servant to sit and endure his endless ramblings, tales of imaginary battles at Waterloo, recounted with a bizarre mixture of penitence and threat. Even in these delirious hours, his constant companion remained alcohol. Champagne and claret flowed freely, bolstering his shaky breath as though wine could somehow steady a collapsing body and mind. By the year 1829, George's faculties had eroded to the point of utter dysfunction. He could no longer read state papers, nor could he sign his name to a single decree. Attendance at Privy Council meetings was impossible, and ministers quietly referred to the care of the monarch as a mere logistical chore rather than governance. Behind closed doors, the machinery of government hummed along without him. Diplomats negotiated treaties, legislators passed bills, and civil servants managed day-to-day affairs as though the sovereign were no more than a decorative relic. Public confidence in the crown waned as rumours of his dire condition spread like wildfire. Whispers in taverns and coffee houses spoke of a king reduced to a feeble ornament, his regal dignity exchanged for a shuffling existence. Parliament began to contemplate formal regency measures, or even emergency powers to transfer authority to William, George's younger brother, should the sovereign become completely incapacitated. The spectre of a throne without a living king sent shudders through Westminster, driving statesmen to draft contingency plans in hushed deliberations. Official bulletins from Kensington Palace laboured to downplay the severity of his plight, speaking only of temporary indispositions and mild indisposition to public duties. Yet the public eye was less easily soothed. Caricaturists pounced on each tidbit of news, and satirical prints depicting the monarch's bloated form and vacant stare flew off the presses. Among the royal artists, Sir David Wilkie, tasked with capturing the king's likeness in the year 1829, lamented in private correspondence that it was the most dismal commission he had ever undertaken. No amount of artist skill or flattering brushwork could mask the anatomical evidence of decay that lay beneath the cloth of state. Within the palace walls, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Nurses dozed fitfully in chairs beside the king's bed, only to be roused by his sudden demands for more laudanum or a fresh goblet of wine. The hush of the corridors was punctuated by the hiss of his wheezing breath and the occasional anguished cry. Chandeliers overhead dimmed as the gaslights were turned low, casting long shadows that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between monarch and marionette. In the public square, skepticism hardened into cynicism. A generation that had once cheered his lavish balls and majestic pageantry now regarded him as a cautionary tale, an emblem of how absolute power, when untethered from responsibility, decays into impotence. Journalists speculated freely on the future of the monarchy, while a cautious minority called for constitutional reform to ensure that no future sovereign might similarly abdicate duty in favour of disgrace. Thus did the last flicker of George IV's reign fade into twilight. A king who had once reshaped London's cultural life and dazzled Europe with gilded marvels was reduced to an object of pity and satirical scorn. His final years were not marked by statesmanship or valour, but by anonymous caretaking and the cold machinery of government operating in his absence. In that somnolent end, the monarchy itself found a stark reminder that a crown, when borne by a body, undone by excess, can become less a symbol of stability and more a relic of ruin. As the end drew near, King George IV's health deteriorated with alarming rapidity. His heart, weakened by years of overindulgence, struggled to circulate blood through a body swollen with dropsy. He could no longer lie flat. Instead, he slept propped upright on a series of pillows, each breath a labour as his engorged limbs fought the pulses of fluid that had settled in his tissues. His skin, once polished by royal barbers, now looked stretched tight over bloated flesh. Boils erupted across his body, their surfaces splitting open to weep foul-smelling pus. Servants, summoned by mournful orders, were forced to cleanse every fold of skin by hand, but no bath, no matter how elaborate, could accommodate his immense girth. For weeks he lay unwashed, and the chambers of Windsor Castle reeked with the stench of decay. Visitors, once welcomed with formal bows, now approached only with handkerchiefs pressed firmly over their noses, hastening their departures as soon as etiquette allowed. In stark contrast to the resplendent portraiture that once immortalized him, the gleaming robes, the powdered wig, the confident bearing George had become two men in one. On canvas he remained the regal sovereign, a vision of authority and grace. In reality, he was a living corpse, marred by rot and ravaged by nature's unkind hand. The juxtaposition was jarring. Statuesque paintings hung in silent galleries while, just beyond the door, the king languished in a makeshift infirmary, his breathing rasping and uneven. His addiction to laudanum liquid opium further blurred the boundaries of his fading mind. He would swallow spoonfuls of the amber tincture in hopes of quelling his pain, only to drift into fugues of amnesia. He forgot the very words spoken to him. Then, in a fit of paranoia, lashed out at the attendants he believed had deceived him. Their compassionate care was repaid with accusations. They were traitors, who manipulated his suffering for gossip, and gossip alone. In those hallucinatory moments, the king's psyche fractured. He would declare, with fevered intensity, that he had ridden at Waterloo, leading cavalry charges against Napoleon's legions, phantom memories that dissolved at the first sober glance. Then, as the laudanum's grip loosened, he would collapse into tears, eyes swollen and reddened, mourning the life he had squandered in endless revelry. Such bizarre oscillations between grandiosity and crushing remorse only deepened his despair, driving him further into the abyss of mental anguish. Each day unfolded as a cruel repetition. Vital signs measured, minute by minute, draughts of laudanum administered, meals delivered by trembling hands, and the soft click of the wheelchair's wheels as he was shifted from bed to chair and back again. The corridors around him resonated with the hollow echo of his fragile presence, as though the walls themselves mourned the collapse of a once mighty dynasty. In those final weeks, no pleas for relief went unanswered. Physicians experimented with tonics and poultices, but the torrent of sores and the flood of fluid were beyond remedy. The king's own pleas grew more desperate. He begged for anything that might grant him a reprieve. Miracle cures from abroad, secret remedies whispered by quacks, even whispered prayers from visiting clergy. Yet each fleeting promise dissolved into disappointment and renewed suffering. And so, in the hush before dawn, as shadows lengthened across Windsor's ancient stones, King George IV lingered between worlds, neither fully alive nor entirely gone. His body, once the vessel of regal splendor, had become a testament to the ruin brought on by unmeasured indulgence. His mind, once celebrated for wit and charm, now flickered with false memories and tearful regrets. In that final, sleep-laden hour, the echo of his gallery-filling laughter had faded, replaced by the rasp of a single, fractured breath, a solemn reminder that even the greatest crown cannot protect against the ravages of a life unrestrained. In the month of June in the year 1830, King George IV descended to the very nadir of his torment. On the night of the 25th of June, he writhed in agony as his flesh turned a ghastly shade of grey, and each breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. A small team of physicians, among them Sir William Waller, one of the few loyal oculists left, kept vigil by his bed, monitoring his failing pulse and murmuring prayers under flickering candlelight. Then, at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 26th of June, the king was seized by a sudden internal hemorrhage, a rupture of a gastric blood vessel brought on by decades of intemperance and obesity. His final anguished cry, "Sir Henry Halford," echoed through the still corridors before his breath stilled at precisely 3:15, drawing the curtain on his long, tragic performance. The subsequent post-mortem laid bare the grim results of his self-destruction. A dense mantle of adipose tissue enveloped his heart and kidneys, compressing those vital organs until they scarcely functioned. His liver lay scarred and fibrotic, the evidence of chronic alcoholism inscribed in every hardened lobe. And there, in the ruptured vessel of his stomach, lay the immediate cause of death, a weakened artery that had finally given way beneath the unrelenting pressure. News of his passing swept through London faster than any royal proclamation, but in place of customary mourning, the city exhaled in quiet relief. The Times, ever unflinching, published an obituary dripping with irony. What eye has ever wept for him? What heart has ever heaved a single unfeigned pang of sorrow? In the days that followed, throngs assembled at Windsor Castle, not to pay homage, but to gawk at the colossal coffin of Spanish mahogany lined in lead. It was so heavy that palace corridors had to be reinforced with oak planks to bear its weight, and a system of pulleys and steel beams was rigged above the royal vault to lower it into the earth without mishap. The funeral at St. George's Chapel was less a solemn requiem than a hushed exhibition of relief. Whispered conversations filled the nave, but not one tear was shed. Even the Duke of Wellington, once George's comrade in arms, voiced his scorn unabashedly, calling him the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life. When William IV, the late king's younger brother, ascended the throne, England collectively sighed in unburdened hope. No longer would ministers tiptoe around a monarch whose whims determined state affairs. No more would Parliament need facsimile seals to enact the nation's business. The transition felt like a reprieve from a long, harrowing nightmare. Citizens believed that at last the crown would be worn by a man capable of both dignity and duty, rather than hung upon the shoulders of a sovereign undone by his own appetites. And so, in that sleepy aftermath, as the final echoes of trumpets faded and the pleasantries of condolence gave way to earnest planning for a new reign, the legacy of George IV settled into history, not as a tale of triumph, but as a sombre warning. His life, gilded in excess and crowned in folly, ended in a whisper of relief, rather than a storm of tears, an enduring testament to the perils of unrestrained indulgence and the fragile humanity that lies beneath every crown. The post-mortem examination of King George IV laid bare the catastrophic toll of 3 decades of bodily excess. Physicians discovered a substantial layer of adipose tissue encasing nearly every vital organ. His heart and kidneys lay imprisoned beneath this thick mantle of fat, their capacity to function reduced to a fragile whisper. In his stomach, a blood vessel had ruptured under relentless pressure, triggering the massive hemorrhage that claimed him on that final night. Further inspection revealed a liver that had lost all resilience, transformed into a fibrotic mass from years of chronic inebriation. His lungs, compromised by edema and compression, struggled to draw a full breath, while the heart itself bore scars of repeated strain. Even more telling were the traces of laudanum, the liquid opiate he had long consumed as sediment in his blood, confirming a habit of self-anesthetization that spanned years. This grim, anatomical portrait dispelled any notion that his passing was a gentle surrender to old age. Instead, it was the direct outcome of eating and drinking oneself to death. A tragic lesson in pathology that spanned the perils of obesity, alcoholism, and substance abuse. In modern terms, his condition exemplified metabolic overload and organ failure, yet the medical establishment of the 1830s was ill-prepared to harness these findings for systematic study. Rather than charting a new path for clinical understanding, physicians and surgeons of the era treated the results as a moral exemplar. The king's corpse became a grisly tableau in advocacy for temperance and moderation. Anatomy theatres might once have revered his regal status, but now they displayed his dissected organs as cautionary exhibits. Medical journals printed the coroner's report alongside sermons warning against the seductions of luxury, contending that the same opulence that adorned Carlton House had ultimately strangled its master's vitality. In the newsrooms of London, newspapers seized upon the autopsy's most lurid details. Sketches of the king's heart, circled by ring after ring of fatty tissue, accompanied columns lambasting the monarchy's excesses. Caricaturists turned the ruptured vessel into a symbol of royal folly, emblazoning cartoons with captions such as, "A monarch's meal turns to betrayal." The public devoured these sensational accounts with a mixture of revulsion and schadenfreude, their laughter echoing the sentiment that George's destruction was both inevitable and richly deserved. Yet beneath the mocking jests lay a deeper discomfort, the realization that a sovereign, raised to embody national virtue, could succumb so fully to vice. Clergymen preached that even kings must bow to the laws of moderation, while philosophers debated whether any institution of power could withstand the seduction of self-indulgence. In salons and taverns, earnest discussions juxtaposed George IV's artistic patronage with the human cost of his extravagance, questioning why posterity would remember only the cautionary corpse and not the cultural achievements he once championed. Despite these spirited debates, the medical community largely failed to convert the king's case into robust research. There were no follow-up studies on the long-term effects of chronic laudanum use, no early movements toward dietary guidelines or addiction treatment protocols. Instead, the 1830s doctors leaned into moralizing, using the autopsy as a sermon rather than a scientific springboard. The body of George IV thus became less a catalyst for medical progress than a model of ruin, its lessons confined to didactic pamphlets and scolding editorials. In the annals of pathology, few cases could rival the stark clarity of his dissection. Yet the era's reticence to embrace systematic inquiry meant that this rich trove of clinical data remained untapped. For a brief moment, the kingdom pondered the grave consequences of excess, only to return swiftly to its routines, comforted by the belief that such horrors belonged to an age of singular misfortune. And so the tragic demise of George IV stood as both a vivid anatomical lesson and a missed opportunity, a somber reminder that the greatest lingering legacy of indulgence may be not knowledge gained, but wisdom squandered. News of King George IV's passing swept through the streets of London like a cold gust, met not with universal mourning, but with a muted, almost furtive relief. Unlike the customary outpouring of grief that had once followed the death of a monarch, the populace regarded the fallen sovereign as little more than an oversized corpse, punished by his own flagrant indulgence. When the Times published its obituary sharp as a rapier's thrust, no editor felt compelled to veil the sarcasm. What eye has ever wept for him? What heart has ever heaved one unselfish pang of sorrow? Such cutting words encapsulated a collective sentiment that George IV had never known genuine friendship, and his demise evoked no true regret. Cartoonists capitalized on this widespread disdain, producing caricatures that compared his massive coffin to a butcher's cart piled high with raw meat. Lithographs circulated showing gawkers swarming the palace gates, handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, as though they sought to catch a whiff of the decay that clung to Carlton House's corridors. Even in death, the king's reputation served as both spectacle and warning, a public fascination born of schadenfreude rather than sorrow. In the taverns of Whitehall and the coffee houses of Fleet Street, patrons exchanged hushed stories of the monarch's final fetid hours. With pints of porter in hand, they toasted the end of an era defined by grotesque opulence. "At last," whispered a dockworker named Harris, "we can breathe again without fear of the crown's rancid stench." Such commentary, wide-eyed and hushed, underscored the extent to which the public had grown weary of a ruler whose every banquet and carriage ride symbolized excess run rampant. Meanwhile, the palace seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, far more tangible than any public eulogy. Staff who had once struggled under the monarch's flamboyant demands now spoke openly of the liberation they felt. Chambers that had reeked of rot and opiates fell silent, as if the very walls exhaled in welcome reprieve. Though decorum demanded that a veneer of sorrow be maintained within the palace gates, behind closed doors the courtiers quietly unclasped their mourning badges, ready to resume the routines of governance without the shadow of George's mercurial whims. The sardonic tone of newspaper coverage only intensified in the days after his death. Headlines boasted of the mammoth coffin and royal relief, while opinion columns speculated on the prospects for a more subdued and dutiful reign under William IV. Even those who had once admired George's architectural patronage or artistic tastes found themselves bowing to the prevailing mood, that no contribution, however grand, could atone for a lifetime squandered in self-gratification. Yet beneath the public jests lay a quiet reckoning. Londoners, accustomed to the unvarnished pomp of monarchy, began to question whether their own fascination with spectacle had played a part in George's tragic downfall. Philosophers and moralists debated in smoky clubs whether the true lesson of his reign lay not in laughable excesses, but in the fragility of human restraint. If Britain's first gentleman could be undone by his own appetites, what safeguard remained for any ruler in an age of growing democracy and shifting mores? In the hush that followed the final notices and caricatures, one truth remained unchallenged. George IV's death, marked by a collective shrug rather than a mournful tear, had become an epochal turning point. The crown, once a gleaming symbol of national pride, had been sullied by indulgence so extreme that even the most loyal subject refused to shed a single tear. And so, as the crowds dispersed from Windsor Castle and the caricatures faded from newsstands, London settled into an uneasy calm, haunted by the echo of its own relief, and wary of the next tale of power's perilous excess. The funeral of George IV unfolded as a spectacle of chaotic mismanagement, its very scale verging on the absurd. Undertakers, confronted with the task of containing such a colossal corpse, commissioned a coffin of Spanish mahogany lined in thick lead. This reinforced sarcophagus was engineered not only to bear the king's prodigious weight, but also to seal away the inevitable stench that emanated from his decayed form. To accommodate the coffin's girth and mass, palace corridors were shored up with heavy planks of oak, laid end to end like a temporary causeway. Above the royal vault in St. George's Chapel, carpenters installed a system of pulleys and steel beams, an industrial contrivance more fitting for a dockyard than a house of worship, so the casket could be lowered without shattering the stonework. Despite its veneer of regal solemnity, the funeral cortege moved at a maddeningly slow pace. Knights in tarnished armour trudged alongside pallbearers who laboured under their burden, sweat beading on their brows as they strained against gravity. Attendees, decked in sombre black, shifted from foot to foot along the makeshift wooden walkway, the echo of their boots mingling with whispers of protest. Too cumbersome. Is this ever over? Many guests leaned wearily on one another, stifling yawns as the procession meandered through the palace precincts, their rigid masks of respect cracking into expressions of thinly concealed irritation. Inside St. George's Chapel, the atmosphere was eerily devoid of genuine mourning. Instead of heartfelt sobs, one heard only the low murmur of conversation and the occasional rustle of silk. Eyes flicked toward the lead-lined coffin resting atop a raised bier, as though waiting for it to spring open. A handful of morbidly curious onlookers had gathered not to pay tribute, but to confirm that, yes, the king had indeed passed away. Children perched on balcony railings, wide-eyed, while their elders exchanged sidelong glances. A funeral, they mused, more akin to a macabre exhibition than a sacred farewell. Even the officiating clergy seemed caught between solemn duty and suppressed disapproval. The royal chaplain's voice reverberated through the vaulted ceiling as he intoned the ancient liturgy, yet his words felt hollow against the peculiar backdrop of mechanical cranes and reinforced corridors. Occasionally, a hushed cough punctuated the silence, or a nervous shuffle as an overburdened courtier sought reprieve from cramped postures. No tears stained the prayer books. No quivering lips betrayed genuine loss. The ritual, meticulously choreographed, unfolded with all the warmth of a military parade rather than the intimacy of a family goodbye. Outside the chapel doors, the pallbearers prepared for the coffin's final descent. The pulleys groaned under the weight, metal creaking as the mahogany box inched downward. Those assembled held their breath, half expecting a disaster would the supports crack. Would the coffin tilt and spill its grisly contents? When at last it settled into the vault with a muffled thud, a collective exhale rose from the crowd, as if a burden had been lifted. Yet still, no laments were uttered, only the soft rasp of cloaks and the whisper of feet turning away. By the time the last mourner had slipped through the chapel's arched doorway, the funeral's grandiloquence had revealed its true character. A grotesque pantomime, a testament to power's final absurdity. The ornate banners and regimental drums, once symbols of sovereignty, now seemed like props in a farcical play. And as the palace gates swung closed behind the departing cortege, one could almost sense the relief that permeated the air. A relief born not of sorrow, but of escape from a performance that had outlived its dignity. In that quiet aftermath, as the candles guttered and the hush settled over Windsor's ancient stones, the funeral of George IV stood as a cautionary tableau, that even the most elaborate honours cannot dignify a life undone by excess. And in the stillness, the echo of the chapel's empty nave seemed to whisper a final irony, that the greatest spectacle of all had been the spectacle of its own unravelling. Almost immediately after the funeral, public discourse turned once more to the troubled legacy of George IV. Among the most resounding voices was that of the Duke of Wellington, Britain's most esteemed war hero and statesman who delivered a biting verdict. He was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life. Such a stark appraisal reverberated through the corridors of power and the drawing rooms of society alike, a reminder that even the loftiest titles could not mask the king's character flaws. Meanwhile, his younger brother William, soon to reign as William IV, ascended the throne to a chorus of genuine relief. Though William, like any man, had his own imperfections, he at least possessed the capacity to read dispatches, sign treaties, and hold counsel without drifting into opium-infused stupors. In the eyes of many, his succession amounted to the deliverance of the crown from a long, harrowing nightmare. The machinery of state, so often hampered by George's mercurial whims, now chugged forward with renewed vitality. At Carlton House, the household staff exchanged cautious glances of optimism. No longer would they await the king's capricious commands or nurse him through nights of delirium. In Parliament, ministers echoed the sentiment of rescue, as bills long stalled by uncertainty were finally brought to the floor. Debates on public works, naval strategy, and colonial governance regained their momentum, free from the ghost of George's extravagant reign. Yet, even as they welcomed the stability of William's rule, critics could not fully forget the cultural patronage of his brother. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, with its onion-shaped domes and oriental flourishes, remained a marvel of imaginative architecture. Windsor Castle's newly refurbished state apartments, adorned in Benjamin Dean Wyatt's neoclassical style, testified to the artistic vision that had found favour under George's reign. These gifts to posterity were acknowledged with respectful nods, yet many observers felt that they paled beside the broader calamity of scandal and moral failure. In clubs and taverns, gentlemen debated the cost-benefit of such extravagance. Yes, the pavilion is a sight to behold, one aristocrat conceded over a glass of port. But at what price? Could not half those funds have built hospitals or schools? Poets and pamphleteers seized on this irony, composing verses juxtaposing the exotic beauty of Brighton with the grotesque dysfunction of the monarchy. London's coffeehouses buzzed with talk of budgetary reform, as citizens increasingly demanded greater oversight of royal expenditures. Nonetheless, the era's historians found themselves in a quandary. How to weigh George IV's contributions to Britain's architectural and artistic heritage against the scale of his excesses? Some argued that without his munificent patronage, the Regency style might never have flourished. Others countered that such flash of creativity should not excuse an epic waste of public funds and a reign marked by personal demise. Editorials in the Times and the Morning Chronicle presented both sides, though always with an undercurrent of judgment that George's moral failures overshadowed any aesthetic achievements. Even within the royal family, a subtle shift took place. William IV chose a more modest approach to governance and presentation, eschewing diamond-studded coronation robes in favour of sober black and silver. His inaugural address to Parliament spoke of prudence and humility as guiding principles, a pointed contrast to the flamboyant self-indulgence of his predecessor. Courtiers who had once adorned themselves in the latest Georgian fashions now found themselves dressing with less ostentation, reflecting a monarchy in search of renewed dignity. And so, in the weeks and months following the funeral, the nation engaged in a collective act of reckoning. The era of George IV was dissected and debated, its aesthetic triumphs weighed against its moral catastrophes. Though the beauty of Brighton's pavilion and the splendour of Windsor's interiors endured, they stood as bittersweet monuments, reminders that the finest art can be tarnished by the character of its patron. In this sleepy reflection, Britain slowly turned its gaze to the future under William IV, hopeful that lessons learned from George's tumultuous reign would guide the crown toward a more balanced and honourable path. History remembers George IV, not as a statesman of towering achievement, but as a cautionary tale of unrestrained excess. The virtues of thrift, humility, and dutiful governance, once the bedrock of monarchical legitimacy, were entirely eclipsed in his reign by personal ambition and a voracious appetite for opulence. To posterity, his legacy reads less like the annals of a king's triumphs than the chronicle of a reign undone by indulgence and the reckless squandering of the public purse. In the ledger of George's rule, the only tally that truly matters is that of profligacy. The cost of diamond, studded coronation robes, the endless banquets that consumed tons of meat and rivers of wine, the palaces transformed into glittering follies. Each architectural marvel he commissioned, from the exotic domes of the Royal Pavilion at Brighton to the neoclassical grandeur of Windsor's refurbished state apartments, was paid for with funds that might have built hospitals, schools, or canals. Such acts of patronage, once hailed as the pinnacle of royal benevolence, now sit uncomfortably alongside an empire, crippled by the debts his extravagance entailed. Historians have often characterized his tenure as nothing more than a tragic farce, a siren song of pleasure that led a whole nation to the brink of ruin. His personal downfall, his ballooning girth, his reliance on laudanum, his final collapse into a stupor of agony stands as vivid proof that boundless authority, when left unchecked by moral constraint, can metastasize into self-destruction. From a medical perspective, the circumstances of George's demise should have signaled a watershed moment in the study of obesity and addiction. The post-mortem revealed deposits of fat so massive they crushed his organs, a liver irreversibly scarred by alcohol, and the presence of opiates coursing through his veins. Yet, in an era unready for such frank revelations, the medical profession treated the findings not as a springboard for research, but as a grim moral lesson. Sin, they concluded, must lead to suffering. Only decades later would physicians begin to probe the physiological mechanisms of metabolic disease and chemical dependency, discoveries that, had they come earlier, might have spared both crown and country. Even now, students of royal history refer to George IV by the sobriquet, the living corpse, a chilling emblem of decay, both physical and moral. Paintings that once celebrated his peerless elegance now seem grotesquely ironic, as if mocking a sovereign who wore beauty like a mask over a rotting core. In literature and film, his story endures as the archetype of the ruler undone by ungovernable appetite, a spectral warning that any individual, no matter how elevated, can be undone by the basest of human frailties. And so his saga became more than a chapter in Britain's past. It became a universal parable. How easy it is to mistake privilege for virtue, to equate power with entitlement. How swiftly one can slip from public affection into private ruin when generosity gives way to greed. George IV reminds us that absolute power, if divorced from the anchor of responsibility, will inevitably sour into tyranny over oneself. His life, a tapestry woven with threads of grandeur and folly, leaves us with a singular refrain, that the greatest peril of too much is not simply the emptiness of excess, but the hollowing out of the soul. In the twilight of collective memory, George's glittering court has faded into the sepia tones of caution. The grand edifices he commissioned stand not as everlasting triumphs, but as monuments to the fragile alchemy between patronage and profligacy. Future monarchs, scholars, and citizens alike draw from his downfall a vital lesson, that the true measure of greatness lies not in the splendor one can command, but in the restraint one can uphold. For in the end, the perils of untempered pleasure and the corruption of boundless power remain as potent today as they were in the silhouette of a king laid low by his own appetites.